Hello and welcome to Newsclick. The commercial release of BT brinjal has been put under an indefinite moratorium. The Minister of Environment and Forests, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, has accepted that independent studies need to be done to examine the safety aspects of BT brinjal.
It is my duty to adopt a cautious, precautionary principle-based approach and impose a moratorium on the release of BT brinjal till such time independent scientific studies establish to the satisfaction of both the public and professionals the safety of the product.
The Minister has also accepted that there is a need for a regulatory body for such approvals, and the Genetic Engineering Approval Committee should be looked upon as a safety appraisal committee and not the final approving authority. Though this obviously does not end the BT brinjal issue or the debate, it does clear the ground for the next round of sparring that is bound to follow on the larger issue of genetically modified crops for Indian agriculture. Mr. Sharad Pawar, the Agricultural Minister, has already fired the first salvo, making clear that he and his ministry are in favor of introducing GM crops in India and feels that 7 years of testing and appraisal by agricultural experts should have laid to rest the doubts raised. Mr. Jairam Ramesh had perhaps very little room to maneuver, as 10 different states had already come on record expressing their opposition to the release of BT brinjal before examining all the issues raised during the appraisal and the review process. With such a large opposition to BT brinjal, his action of declaring a moratorium is possibly a way to buy more time on this. Significantly, he has accepted that the Indian seed industry, falling under the control of Monsanto and other multinational corporations, would be a long-term threat to Indian agriculture. Whether this is an empty statement or the government has some plans in trying to indigenize BT and other GM technologies remains to be seen. The issues on which the critics have opposed the introduction of BT brinjal were on the dangers of BT being introduced in the food chain and the control of Indian agriculture passing into MNC hands. There has also been the issue that all the data that has been used for such approval being only of Monsanto origin and the way the GEAC has conducted itself. If you look at Indian agriculture, we need to go back to the 1960s to see how a new technology can make a tremendous difference. The Green Revolution changed the productivity of Indian agriculture, and from India producing about 12 million tons of wheat, boosted wheat production to about 78 million tons today. Without the Green Revolution and the introduction of new wheat varieties, India would probably have been unable to feed its population and possibly have joined the ranks of failed states. All of us remember the PL 480 days when the US dictated terms to India because without importing PL 480 wheat, India was unable to feed its people. The significant difference between then and now is that the Green Revolution came from public domain science. It was entirely funneled through universities and Indian Council of Agricultural Research. The Green Revolution now, on the other hand, is under the control of a few global multinational corporations. Even worse, the Indian public research bodies, instead of developing independent technologies, are becoming conduits for such global corporations. The Monsantos of the world are likely to dominate the next generation of GM technologies, bringing back the issue of who controls Indian agriculture and therefore the food security of the country. However, a large number of groups, instead of taking up this particular issue, are claiming that all genetically modified organisms have unknown risks and we should therefore put a blanket ban on such technologies. It is difficult to understand the scientific basis for such a position.
I think that GM crops will be a major factor in future agriculture. And while there are certainly legitimate issues around genetic modification of crops, primarily to do with the fact that it's an abrupt modification rather than a gradual modification, which is what nature normally introduces, it is possible to overstate the risks involved. Equally, it's not difficult to imagine good practices in risk containment in the GM crop arena. And therefore, I don't think that there is anything intrinsically unacceptable about GM crops. We do need to make a case-by-case determination of risk. We do in all technology categories. But that's the nature of the technological beast. I don't think anything beyond that is needed. There is, however, a fundamental issue with what kind of genetic modification we are using. And there, the current GM is in a certain sense an example of doing the silly thing and doing it for profit.
We also need to be clear that there is no Chinese wall between food and non-food crops. That is, while food crops require particular attention, almost all crops enter the food chain in one way or another. A case in point is BT cotton in India. BT cotton stocks go into cattle feed, and milk products obviously come from cattle. If large-scale ill effects existed with BT, we should probably have seen it by now. BT maize is widely grown in the United States, and we have not yet seen ill effects of BT in the food chain there. An examination of GM crops in the Chinese and Indian cases would illustrate the importance of who controls the technology. In India, BT cotton is largely of Monsanto origin, leading to a significant difference between the price of BT and non-BT cotton seed. In China, on the other hand, the costs are only slightly higher for BT seeds, as China also has an indigenous BT technology that is non-Monsanto. The Indian farmers' use of pesticide has not decreased with the introduction of BT as was expected. With such high-value seeds, the farmers in India needs to protect the crop from other pests and therefore uses as much if not more pesticide. In China, on the other hand, BT cotton has seen pesticide use come down significantly. Therefore, who controls the technology is significant in the way farmers use BT seeds and pesticides. BT cotton has been a success in India. The yields have gone up significantly, and 90% of the cotton cultivation in India is now BT cotton. The farmers have voted with their plows for BT cotton. However, Monsanto has at the same time reaped a bonanza from the growth of BT cotton in India. The farmers were initially paying a technology fee component of Rs 725 for a 450 gram packet of seed costing Rs 1600. If this had continued, this would have meant about Rs 1000 crore per year as transfer from Indian farmers to Monsanto. Even after state governments forced Monsanto to slash prices, Monsanto gets about Rs 360 crores per year from Indian farmers. This is apart from what the seed companies get, which are also partly owned by Monsanto. The risk to Indian agriculture is once we are dependent on Monsanto for the essential technology, what is to stop Monsanto from charging monopoly prices as they did earlier? As long as they are seeking entry of other crops such as BT brinjal, they may behave. What is to prevent them later from ratcheting up the prices? Does the Indian government have any plans to prevent this from happening? Genetic modifications are not rocket science. What stands in the way is an intellectual property rights regime which seeks to create private monopolies for such technologies. Instead of looking at this end of the problem and working out how Indian public sector science can keep the gene revolution in the public domain, the Indian political establishment is more interested in surrendering this space to global corporations. Today, Monsanto sits in key committees of the government fixing up India's research priorities. A large number of scientists are climbing into the private bandwagon and are trying to convert Indian scientific institutions as sources of cheap labor for global corporations. The problem with the Franken-Food and Franken-Crop lobby is that they are only focused on stopping GM crops, sometimes by arguments if possible, or with bad science and downright scaremongering if arguments fail. They have very little interest in how to use science for the public good. For them, science itself is a danger and is to be opposed, with or without a Monsanto. Unfortunately, the gene revolution is coming, and we can either follow it wringing our hands and condemning it as it marches on, or we can drop its boundaries, create appropriate regulatory structures, and see that its fruits remain in the public domain. The BT brinjal debate brings out both these sets of issues. Science will not solve all social problems, but neither can we find a solution to all social problems without science. Hunger and food security will not be solved with only science, nor will they be solved without it.